Hi, everybody. Last time we talked about Korah in the wilderness with the Israelites and what happened there. And today we're going to go on and talk a little bit more about the Israelites. We talked about how they had left Egypt in Goshen and they went down to Mara and Elam. Rephidim is where Moses hit the rock with the instructions of God so that water could come out for the people. They went to Mount Sinai, up to Kadesh Barnea. They did not go in the promised land because of fear, and then they were wandering around the wilderness. Well, their punishment for not going into the promised land when God had told them he wanted to, that this was their time, that he was going to give that land to them, and they were too afraid to go. Their punishment for not believing in him was that they were going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And all of the people who were adults would die, but their children, the ones that were younger than that, they would be able to go into the promised land at that time when 40 years was done. So time had passed and a lot of people had died. It was getting closer to the time when they could go into the promised land. You would think that the people that were left, the people that had grown up and seen everything that had happened, you would think that they would be getting kind of excited and they're ready to go into the promised land. However, instead, their hearts were getting very discouraged because of the way, because of all the walking in the wilderness. They were getting discouraged. They were getting tired out. They began to complain again. And this time, they were complaining that there was no water. And they were murmuring against Moses and against Aaron, just like their parents had done, just like they had heard the older people complaining in the past. They were complaining about Moses and Aaron and how they were so bad to have taken them away from Egypt, from their lives of bliss, apparently, with all their yummy food and water, forgetting that they had been slaves. And they complained that they had taken them out to the wilderness. So once again, Moses and Aaron, as they always did, they fell down to pray to God, to see what should be done, to say they needed water. And God gave them some instructions. He said, get your rod, gather the people in front of a rock by the camp there, and as the people watch, I want you to speak to the rock, and there'll be lots of water. There will be water enough for all the people and their animals. I want you to do this to honor me in front of the people. Even though Moses was called a friend of God, and he was called a very, very meek man, the meekest man in all the earth, Moses also must have been having a hard time at that point, and he lost his temper. He gathered the people as God had said. He got his rod as God had said. He went to the rock as God had said. But instead of speaking to the rock, he struck the rock. Just like when they had been at Rephidim originally and God told him to strike the rock, he struck the rock not once but twice. He hit it instead of speaking to it as God had said. And not only that, he was in such a grumpy place, he said to the people, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Well, that was a really silly thing to say because Moses was not bringing any water out of the rock. It was God who was bringing the water out of the rock. He had no authority to do what he did and to say what he said. Now, God had mercy on the people and he let the water come out of the rock anyway. And there was enough for all the people and their animals, just as God had said. But this time, the punishment was not for the people. The punishment was for Moses and Aaron because they had gotten angry and disobeyed God in the instructions he had given. Unfortunately, what they had done was bigger than they realized, because with this little object lesson, God had planned to show something very special. In the Bible, it talks about Jesus being the rock of our salvation. And the rock where the water was supposed to come out of was supposed to be a type of Christ, the rock. The water coming out was to be like the rivers of life, the living waters that God supplies to all who come to him and ask. And he was not supposed to strike the rock because the rock had already been struck back at Rephidim. And Jesus only had to die once for all. There was no continuing sacrifice. One sacrifice for sin, for all, forever. And so by striking the rock again, twice, it ruined the picture of Jesus being struck once and then the water coming out. And then now, once someone puts their trust and faith in him and his salvation by his death, then they only need to speak to him to receive his blessings. So the type was ruined, the object lesson was ruined, and Moses and Aaron had to be punished. Their punishment was a big punishment. The punishment was they were not going to be able to go into the promised land after all those years. The whole point of everything they had done over the past number of years was to go with the Israelites into the promised land, and now they wouldn't be able to go. They had to take their punishment without bitterness because of what they had done. So as they traveled farther, they came to a mountain, and God told Moses and Aaron's son, Eleazar, to go up the mountain. And he told Aaron to take off his high priestly robes, the symbolic coverings that God had provided for the high priest. Each piece had a symbolism. He was to take those off and put them on his son to show all the Israelites that Eleazar was going to be the new high priest and God had chosen him. And then Aaron would die there on the mountain and they would have to leave him there. And so that's what happened. The people mourned for Aaron for 30 days and then they had to continue on. Well, as they continued on, the people were discouraged again. They were tired of walking. They were tired of not having food other than the manna and the other things that they were getting now and then. They were tired of not having gardens and things that they could eat from. They were discouraged. It's a very effective weapon that Satan can use against God's people. When things don't go our way, instead of having faith in God, sometimes we are tempted to become discouraged. But God does not want us to be discouraged. He says, "Let not your heart be troubled." Discouragement is the opposite of faith, and it leads to complaining, which is what they did. They started complaining again against Moses and against Aaron and against God because God had brought them to the place they were at. They were whining and complaining. And so God sent fiery serpents into the camp to bite the people. And when they were bitten, they would get sick and die. The people came to Moses, and this time they were sorry for what they had done. They said, "Can you please help us? We have sinned. We have done wrong. We should not have been complaining. Can you please pray and ask God to take these serpents away from us?" So Moses did. He went and prayed and asked God. And God didn't just take the serpents away. He gave Moses a job to do. He said, "Make a brass image of the serpent and put it up on a pole, a tall pole in the middle of the camp where everyone can see it. And when people look at it, they will be healed." And so that's what Moses did. He quickly went and made a serpent, put it on a rod, and stuck it up in the middle of the camp. And then anyone who was sick, who was bitten, could go and look at the serpent on the pole, and they would be healed. Well, hundreds of years later, Jesus spoke of this incident because this also is a type, a symbol that we can bring from the Old Testament into the New Testament, into our day, so that we can understand the ways of God better. Jesus was speaking to a man named Nicodemus. And he used this illustration when he spoke to him. Nicodemus was saying, how can I go to heaven? And Jesus said, you have to be born again. And Nicodemus said, what? Can I crawl back into my mother's womb and be born again? That doesn't make sense. And Jesus said, even as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. He knew that he was going to die on a cross for the sins of mankind. And if people would look at the cross, look at what he had done for them, repent of their sins and believe on him, that they would be saved and healed from their sins, just as the Israelites looked on the brass serpent and they were healed from their wounds and their illnesses. So this is a very important type, a very important symbol that we have from the Old Testament. The people didn't have to actually do anything. All they had to do was look and they would be healed. But they had to believe enough to go out of their tent and go look at it. They couldn't just lie in their bed and hope for the best. And just like that, anyone who wishes to be saved from their sins, to have the God creator of all the world in their life, can look to Jesus, who died on the cross, the Son of God, who was punished for the sins of the world without sinning himself, and they can be saved as well. We just need to repent and believe and ask. A verse that we have from the story of Nicodemus is John 3:16, which probably everyone knows. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So if you have not yet looked, I urge you to look today, to repent and believe and ask for salvation. Just like the Israelites looked at the serpent on the pole and they were healed. And if you already have done that, make sure that you tell other people about it so that they can know too. Thank you. Bye.